Did you know there are 5 silent sins that could be stealing your financial blessings right now? And I'm not talking about the obvious ones. These are subtle spiritual traps that even faithful believers fall into without realizing it. The Bible contains over 2,350 verses about money and possessions, and throughout these passages, God reveals clear patterns that separate those who experience His provision from those who remain in financial struggle. What's shocking is that these aren't major transgressions. They're everyday attitudes and decisions that seem harmless on the surface, but are actually blocking the flow of abundance in your life. Many Christians pray earnestly for financial breakthrough while unknowingly practicing the very behaviors Scripture warns against. And the most dangerous part? These sins operate in silence, draining your resources slowly and steadily without you even noticing. So in this video, I'm going to expose the 5 silent sins that may be keeping you from the financial freedom God desires for you. This isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about understanding the spiritual laws that govern prosperity and aligning your heart with divine principles. Stay until the end because the 5th sin is the one that destroys more financial futures than any other. 1. The silent sin of covetousness. The first silent sin that drains your money is the sin of covetousness, and it's more common than most people realize. Covetousness isn't just wanting nice things, it's that inward desire to possess what God has given to someone else. When you see your neighbor's new car, and that burning feeling rises in your chest, that's covetousness working. When you scroll through social media comparing your life to others and feeling that deep dissatisfaction with what you have, that's covetousness stealing your peace. The 10th commandment specifically addresses this because God knows how destructive it can be. Covetousness is called the root of theft, robbery, and fraud in spiritual literature. But here's what most people miss. Covetousness doesn't just lead to obvious sins. It creates a spiritual environment where money flows away from you instead of toward you. When you're constantly focused on what others have, you're operating from a mindset of lack rather than abundance. Scripture tells us that covetousness exceeds the natural desire for material things needed to sustain life. It becomes an immoderate desire to acquire, and this imbalance creates chaos in your financial world. People driven by covetousness make impulsive purchases they can't afford. They take on debt to maintain appearances. They chase get-rich-quick schemes because they can't stand watching others prosper while they struggle. But the spiritual consequence is even worse. Covetousness is considered a form of idolatry because it places material possessions above your devotion to God. When money and things become your primary focus, you're no longer operating under divine protection and provision. You're trying to create abundance through human effort alone, and that approach always leads to frustration and financial drain. 2. The silent sin of selfishness in financial decisions. The second silent sin that blocks financial blessings is selfishness, and it manifests in ways most believers never recognize. This isn't about being stingy with charity. It's about making every financial decision based solely on personal benefit without considering God's purposes or the needs of others. When you spend everything on yourself and your immediate wants while ignoring opportunities to bless others, you're operating outside God's design for prosperity. Scripture makes it clear that generosity is directly connected to increase, but selfishness breaks this divine cycle of giving and receiving. People trapped in this sin hoard their resources out of fear, thinking that keeping everything for themselves will create security. Here's the spiritual reality. God designed money to flow, not to stagnate. When you block that flow through selfishness, you create spiritual resistance that manifests as financial problems. Your income may plateau, unexpected expenses may arise, investment opportunities may pass you by. These aren't coincidences. They're the natural consequences of operating against divine principles. Selfishness also reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of stewardship. Everything you have belongs to God, and you're simply the manager. When you manage resources only for personal gain, you're failing in your primary responsibility as a steward. This failure doesn't go unnoticed in the spiritual realm. The Bible warns that those who don't provide for their relatives, and especially their own household, have denied the faith and are worse than unbelievers. But the principle extends beyond family. When you have the means to help others but choose not to because you want to keep everything for yourself, you're positioning yourself outside the flow of divine provision. 3. The silent sin of pride in financial matters. The third silent sin that drains your money is pride, and it's perhaps the most deceptive because it often disguises itself as wisdom or success. Financial pride manifests when you begin to trust in your riches rather than in God. When your bank account becomes your source of security instead of your relationship with the Almighty, you've crossed into dangerous spiritual territory. Scripture warns the rich not to be haughty or set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who provides everything for our enjoyment. Yet many believers fall into this trap as their income increases. They start making decisions based on their own understanding rather than seeking divine guidance. They become confident in their ability to generate wealth and forget that every good gift comes from above. Pride in financial success creates a spiritual blindness that leads to poor decision-making. When you think you have money figured out, you stop consulting the source of all wisdom. You start taking risks that seem smart from a human perspective but violate spiritual principles. You begin to think that your intelligence, hard work, or strategies are the primary reason for your success. This pride sets you up for financial failure because you're operating outside God's protection. The Bible clearly states that whoever trusts in riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. When your hope and trust shift from God to money, you become vulnerable to every economic storm and market fluctuation. Fluctuation. Pride also leads to a dangerous independence from spiritual guidance. When you believe your financial wisdom is sufficient, you stop praying about money decisions. You stop seeking counsel from mature believers. You stop studying what Scripture says about wealth management. This spiritual isolation creates blind spots that inevitably lead to costly mistakes. The most insidious aspect of financial pride is how it corrupts your relationship with God. Money becomes your master instead of your tool. You start serving wealth rather than using it to serve divine purposes. This reversal of roles doesn't just affect your spiritual life. It creates practical problems that drain your resources in unexpected ways. 4. The silent sin of poor stewardship and spiritual neglect. The fourth silent sin that destroys financial blessing is poor stewardship combined with spiritual neglect in money matters. This isn't just about budgeting poorly or making bad investments. It's about completely disconnecting your financial life from your spiritual life, treating money as a purely secular concern. Many believers compartmentalize their faith, keeping it separate from their financial decisions. They pray about relationships, health, and ministry. But when it comes to money, they rely entirely on worldly wisdom. They follow financial advice from secular sources without ever consulting Scripture or seeking divine direction. This spiritual neglect creates a dangerous gap in their stewardship. Poor stewardship manifests in multiple ways. Some people make impulsive purchases without considering the long-term impact. Others accumulate debt carelessly, thinking they can manage it through their own efforts. Some fail to plan for the future, living entirely in the present without preparing for seasons of scarcity like Joseph did in Egypt. But the deeper issue is the failure to recognize that every financial decision has spiritual implications. When you buy something, invest somewhere, or spend money on anything, you're making a statement about your values and priorities. Poor stewards don't understand this connection, so they make choices that conflict with divine principles without even realizing it. Scripture teaches that faithful stewardship in small matters leads to responsibility over greater things. But when you mismanage what God has already given you, why would He trust you with more? Poor stewardship sends a signal to heaven that you're not ready for increased blessing, creating a spiritual ceiling over your financial potential. This sin also includes the failure to seek God's guidance before making significant financial decisions. The world seduces believers into following crowd mentality or accepting advice from sources that don't acknowledge divine authority over money. When you rush ahead without consulting heaven, you step outside divine protection and provision. 5. The silent sin of envy and chronic discontentment. The fifth and most destructive silent sin that drains your money is envy combined with chronic discontentment. This is the sin that rots the bones and destroys more financial futures than any other because it creates a spiritual environment where blessing cannot flourish. Envy goes beyond simply wanting what others have. It's a resentful jealousy that breeds malicious thoughts and destructive actions. When you look at someone else's prosperity and feel that burning resentment, you're not just experiencing an emotion. You're opening a spiritual door that allows lack and limitation to enter your life. These 5 silent sins work together to create a spiritual barrier between you and the financial freedom God desires for you. Covetousness, selfishness, pride, poor stewardship, and envy don't just affect your bank account, they affect your heart, and your heart determines your financial destiny. The good news is that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward transformation. When you align your financial decisions with biblical principles, you position yourself to receive the abundance heaven wants to release in your life. Don't let these silent sins steal another day of blessing from your future.